We are here at the comic book shop to find out how the change in the consumption of comic books have influenced the present-day comic book subculture. A series of interviews with males identified as having either a basic or expert knowledge on comic books were conducted to find out firsthand the difference between past comic book consumers and modern comic book consumers, which will complement our research into past publications. In the next 15 minutes, we will find out how the comic book subculture has changed using key topics in consumer behavior, including perception, disposal, reference groups, and identity. But first, to understand the difference between past and present generations, it is imperative that we provide a little comic book history 101. Comics in America can be traced back to the early 1900s, with comic strips such as the Yellow Kid featured in the daily newspaper. Following the national success of comic strips, DC published Action and Comic Books #1 in 1938, which introduced the first known superhero, Superman. Unlike the short daily strips, comics took a cinematic storytelling approach with colorful and vibrant pictures. The growing popularity led to the creation of other characters such as Batman, Captain America, and Wonder Woman. World War II was a catalyst for comics' growing popularity, with superheroes expressing a common interest in public welfare and strong federal government. For instance, Marvel Comics popularized Captain America by showing him punching Hitler in their earliest issue. During the Silver Age, comics lost readers and publishers alike. People were concerned of the cultural influence of the industry, with comics being accused of corrupting the youth and encouraging violence. However, the 1960s showed signs of recovery as they began to convey society's social ideologies and show superheroes with weaknesses. The position of comics moved from social issues towards an emphasis on form and stylistic detail. Even though the popularity of comic books were growing, actual sales were declining. This was primarily due to the poor distribution of comics. To solve the issue, traditional newsstands were replaced by chain stores in an attempt to revise the marketing structure. Furthermore, DC and Marvel had turned to licensing their brand to television providers for revenue. This marked the beginning of comic book adaptations, including The Incredible Hulk, Batman, and the original Superman movies. The Iron Age was a dark time in comic book history where writers were transfixed on the backstory of their characters. However, comic books were in their prime, with publishers experiencing greater profits from the increase in cost per comic book. Publishers were able to segment the market and find their niche of loyal fans, resulting in the comic book subculture. The modern age of comic books includes the reconstruction of the comic book industry. Comic books are now seen as a collector's item, and the inelasticity of demand for comics have allowed publishers to increase the price and still manage to keep their fan base. This leads us into the research question we will discuss throughout the documentary. How has the change in the consumption of comic books influenced modern comic book fans?
I think everybody wants to be a superhero. I wouldn't necessarily say that I idolize Batman or Superman, for instance, but I think everybody would like to have superpowers.
And why?
I did as a kid very much because I didn't have anybody to really turn to. I was a loner in high school and that type of thing until essentially my friends saved me from the downward spiral in a broken home, or whatever you want to call it. And so there was time where I idolized the heroes. Now it's more along the lines of, I don't really idolize so much fictional characters as I would say idolize real people, or my kids.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Usually nice people, pinnacle of shape, great to get along with. What's not to like?
To a certain extent, yeah, because it's all fantasy. It's things that aren't real. So sometimes you could envision yourself in the role of a superhero, and it's a detachment from the real world and your ideal world.
Definitely. I mean, we use all sorts of different things to escape. Comic books were something that I use for an escape for myself. Reading just in general is an escape for me. Other people, it's video games, it's movies, it's cooking, it's whatever, exercise. All of us need something to have that type of escape, to be able to give ourselves that recharge time. With a comic book, it's a nice thing that most of us have maybe about an hour or so to be able to have in the way of spare time every week or so, to just sit and do nothing. And a comic book, if you read one of the graphic novels, you can read that pretty much in an hour. So you've got that full reading capability to be able to have and work with it.
No, not really.
Our interviewees demonstrated that they want to become more than who they are now. This proves that our comic book subculture has always strived to become the ideal self. In the early 1930s, the predominant view of a hero was an empowered man capable of overcoming difficulties and saving his city from evil. This early view of heroes embodied the ideal characteristics that modern society looks for in an idol. According to Holt and Thomas, the traits of a male are evolving from a position of dominance and strength, similar to the 1930s superheroes, to a position of compassion and free will. However, the ideal self of becoming that dominant, muscular superhero is still the principal view across all generations of comic book fans. Solomon, White, and Dale state that the need of fantasy bridges the gap between the real self and the ideal self. As such, fantasy allows every generation of comic book consumers to escape from their real-world problems and to compensate their lack of external stimulation such as loneliness or bullying. People feeling powerless from their surrounding situations have a stronger need to escape, and, as Rob mentioned, a recharge time. Comic books and their adaptations are a way for past and present comic book readers to be shortly engaged by the stories and escape to a world where they are the superhero.
I collect some of them just to have as a keepsake sort of thing, but the other ones I've either given to family members to try to get them into the sort of culture, or I sell them off to people who appreciate them.
When we opened up the store in 1999, I took 38 boxes of my own personal collection and put it into the store. And then since then I got rid of another 18 boxes worth of comics. So now I'm down to about 12 or 13 boxes worth of comics. So for me, I just pass them on either to my kids, or I'll pass them on to my clientele and be able to make sales off of it.
I've kept most of them. Probably given a few away to my cousin. Lent a few to friends, you know.
On my higher end books, I tend to get them CGC slabbed. They're put in a plastic case, untouched by human hands for the rest of eternity. And they're marked by a company in Florida as for what the grading condition is. So I decide to sell them at some point in time for my first appearances of the characters and that type of thing. I've got them, and they're a worthwhile investment that way. For the most part, most of my comics are just the same as anybody else's. Comic board, bag, in a box. That's it. That's all.
The post-purchase process for comic books is very sentimental. There are 3 processes that consumers can implement after they have finished reading comic books. First, they can store and collect comic books as a hobby. There are many comic book collectors around the world, many of which have ways to store their comic books in order to maximize protection. A common protection strategy is to keep the comics in a waterproof sleeve with a backboard and place it in a storage box for longevity. By collecting comic books, the consumers maintain the emotional attachment to the product or wait for the product to gain in value. Second, consumers can temporarily dispose of comic books by lending them to family or friends. They do so in order to share their experiences, as well as it is a non-permanent disposal solution. Thirdly, consumers can permanently dispose of comic books. This is done in several ways. Consumers can trade or sell comic books at stores or online within their community. Finally, they can donate the comic books to places such as the library or at a thrift store, or even simply dispose of comic books by throwing them in the trash. In the past, throwing out used products was not very common because consumers develop a strong bond to personal possessions and the concept of collecting, whereas the modern comic book subculture has access to electronic versions, which has reduced the overall disposal of comic books.
For me, it's more, I guess, group influence rather than critic influence, because I'd rather listen to my friends who act sort of as opinion leaders rather than a critic's perception of a Marvel movie or a comic book series and whatnot.
Being a retailer and having done it for so long, doing it as 26 years now as a retailer, I've gotten to know a lot of these things, and there's projects where sometimes they're done right, sometimes they're done wrong. A show like Big Bang Theory, for example, ends up appealing to a lot of the new people out there, but they don't. It's still still works on that stereotype of the guy in the mom's basement or socially awkward or whatever. But other things like Watchmen or V for Vendetta or History of Violence or Walking Dead or any of these types of shows and properties where people don't recognize the character ends up bringing in a lot of new readers and a lot of new clientele. If you get something like an Iron Man or a Spider-Man, everybody feels, oh, I've read Spider-Man, I've read Iron Man, it's no big deal. When you get something like The Walking Dead or V for Vendetta, they're like, oh man, this is a comic? Wow, this really catches me off guard. It's not what we expect it to be. So it's really, really changed the environment for sure.
No, not usually concerned with critical ratings.
What I tend to do is we have this discussion a lot. And I read a lot of the stuff that comes out on the shelves because that's my job. My job is to know what you guys are going to like before it happens. So I've got to be in touch with all the different storylines. It's like anything, knowing what the new car is going to be if you're a car salesman. You know, same type of thing ends up happening with this. People value honesty, and I'd rather tell you that I think the story is going to be crap than sell you something and have you be disappointed with it. We have our top 30 sellers here in the store with regards to our graphic novels, so that, again, our customers can see what all of you guys are buying in comparison to say, you know, well, this is something that you might want to read because everybody else is reading it. And we have people having discussions either through our Facebook group or here in the store on a regular basis saying, well, hey, I'll turn and say, well, you know, don't take my word for it. Hey, has anybody here read this? You have? Okay, great. This guy's got a couple of questions. And it's a really fun, positive environment that we end up seeing. And again, it's not just a male-dominated market anymore. Once they started doing the continuation of the Buffy the Vampire Slayer TV series and Stephen King's Dark Tower, we had a huge explosion of female demographic shopping in the store for sure.
Perfect.
Yes, they're the ones that originally got me into comic books and in video games and movies and whatnot, because they were the ones that swayed me in that direction. So as a result, I share the similar interests.
I've met a lot of people through this industry over the years that have become really good friends. Some are big into comics, some are big into Star Wars, some are big into gaming. It's a broad range of everything. You know, but it's always great to be in discussions with people saying, oh, hey, have you read this? Or how's the story in this bit? It's nice to be able to have friends that have common interests for sure. But not all my friends do.
Absolutely.
As Rob mentioned, his external and internal relationships influence whether he would purchase the comic book or see the movie. In the comic book subculture, readers look up to their peers and critics as a source of information for new content. For Rob, the flow of information between fans creates exposure to the comic book shop for new and old readers alike. These relationships are referred to as a reference group. Comic book consumers are now influenced by others' opinions through immediate access to reviews and instant messaging with friends and family. Through our interview with Rob, we found that the utilitarian and informational influences are very much alike in the comic book community. This is a result of people within the comic book subculture looking at each other as not only friends, but as people whose opinions they could trust through blog posts, Facebook, and comic book shop conversations. Value expressive influence also plays a key role in shaping comic book fans' preferences. The journal, Man of Action Heroes by Holt and Thomas, suggests that men are reconstructing themselves as the idealized model of manhood after being emasculated by social changes throughout recent history. Men and women of all ages have turned to comic books as a way to remove themselves from real social issues. The portrayal of heroes in comic books allows the reader to associate themselves with the character, increasing their own self-image. Here in Ottawa, generations of comic book readers have had an opportunity to come together during the biggest comic book event of the year in a brand fest called Comic-Con. Rob mentions that Comic-Con is extremely important to the comic book subculture because people feel empowered being who they want to be without being socially judged by others. The conformity created through similar belief systems at Comic-Con removes the social anxiety usually elicited by the subculture, which is a huge determinant in people now looking at comic books as attractive rather than a product for social outcasts.
It was probably back in elementary school, maybe around like grade 3 or grade 4. And it was during the time of the first Spider-Man movies coming out with Tobey Maguire there, I think. And it just seemed like the popular culture at the time, and I really got into some video games and things of the like. So, yeah.
I pretty much started reading comics around the age of 10 or so. I was having nightmares that were troubling me nonstop. And then one night I was saved by these superheroes that I'd never seen before. The next day I went into the corner store with my dad, and sitting on the rack was Justice League of America number 200. And it had all these superheroes: Firestorm, Elongated Man, Martian Manhunter, Hawkman. And I turned to my dad and I said, well, Dad, can we get this? And he said, sure. So I read it, loved it, and essentially my nightmare stopped. Since then, it developed a whole passion for comic books. I've been collecting Justice League ever since, as well as many other comics. And now I own a comic store.
Just say
The first comic books I would have read would have been the Garfield collections that I read at the library. Would have been in grade 1.
I think because it's more of a geek culture thing rather than just a fad, it doesn't really change that much. For me, it's been sort of the same the whole way through.
When I was a kid, I didn't have a lot in the way of role models, so I turned to a lot of the different superheroes and a lot of the different characters as sort of inspiration, because the people around me were not people that I wanted to aspire to be, and it sort of helped identify me as what I wanted and someone that I could be proud of.
I'd say it's changed little, if at all. I've always found them entertaining.
I don't think there's a maximum. I think it would probably just be a minimum with, I guess, sort of the violence and stuff involved with them. But there's not really a cap age on it. It's geek culture.
Any age whatsoever. A lot of the companies now are coming out with comic books that are good for all ages, introducing these characters at a young age, whether it be the cardboard books for the baby books, or you're looking at my daughter is 4 years old and she's still learning how to read, being in school, but there are silent comic books out there, like one called Ally, for example, where it's just pictures in there, but you can read and understand the story, and I make my daughter tell me the story, so she'll read the book to me, and that's something that gets to be very, very engaging with the young ones, so that they can read at any age.
Say when a child is able to read, he should be able to read what he wants. He can read a comic book.
For almost a century, the buying behavior and social perception of the comic book industry has evolved to meet the needs of the current generation of comic book fans. The differences between past and current comic book consumers can be observed through these behavioral and perceptual changes. A paper by Cosnitz found that the social identity of comic book fans has been challenged throughout the years, but now we're starting to see comic books as less of a nerd culture, but rather a popular culture. That is, the stereotypical view of past comic book fans were that they were social outcasts with few friends. Nowadays, it is common for the majority of modern culture to possess a basic knowledge of the comic book world. Throughout history, there's been a large and diverse comic book subculture that has drawn the attention of marketers. This has led to the present establishment of social activities such as Comic-Con and the sale of comic-related consumer goods. In the early years of comic books, consumers were restricted to the comic-related goods they could purchase. Typically, they could only go out and buy a comic book. Now, consumers can purchase anything from comic book costumes, comic book backpacks, and even comic book furniture. Comic book consumers were once associated with lower to middle class society, whereas now, Gerd and Foster argue that comic books have combined form and content in order to be seen as an academic medium. Finally, improvements in technology over the past couple of decades have provided comic books with global exposure and easy access, eliminating limitations such as not being able to read a $10,000 collector's comic from the 40s. Consumers now have the option to read printed copies, read online copies, watch on-screen adaptations, and even find your favorite superhero on a mobile app. This increased availability of the product is much more convenient for consumers. Comic book readers, whether they are young or old, are now capable of experiencing the comic book adventure anytime and anywhere. The focus of this experiment was to examine the generational differences between past and present comic book consumers. We did so by interviewing several males who fall under the comic book subculture and by observing consumers during a comic book convention. From our interviews, we came to several conclusions based on behavioral and perceptual changes, disposal, reference groups, and age. For one, comic books have always been a source of entertainment, involving supernatural characters that past and present comic book consumers look up to and will continue to look up to. Second, with the advancement in technology, consumers can experience comic books through online databases and mobile apps, unlike previous generations who were limited to physical copies. Third, the comic book subculture has expanded into the online community, allowing friends, families, and critics to offer their opinions and insights on the latest issues and films. And finally, the stereotypical nerd culture that many comic book fans have endured is now a thing of the past. In fact, With the clash of DC and Marvel adaptations, Netflix's $200 million deal with Marvel, and the revision of many classic comic book heroes, some may say we are entering a comic book era.
Spider-Man, Spider-Man, does whatever a spider can. Spins a web any size, catches thieves just like flies. Look out, here comes the Spider-Man.